The Crucifixion. It was still early on that long morning of trial and condemnation when Jesus started his last and most painful journey. The Roman soldiers led him through the north gate of the city to the place of death, called Calvary by the Romans and known as Golgotha in the Hebrew tongue. Both names mean the place of the skull. Jesus staggered up the hillside carrying the heavy cross upon which he was later to be nailed, for it was the custom among the Romans that those who were about to die by execution should carry their own crosses. His back was bowed beneath the weight of the great wooden beam as he walked, and his feet stumbled on the rough road. A great company of people gathered and followed him as he slowly climbed the hill to Calvary. Some were enemies who mocked him, some were passing strangers who joined the throng through curiosity or chance, and some were his friends who longed to help him but could not. The women among them wailed and wept, lamenting Jesus and beating their breasts with sorrow as they saw his suffering and knew that worse was yet to come. And even with the racking pain in his body and the cross upon his back, Jesus saw their sorrow. He turned his head to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep rather for yourselves and for your children. For a time is coming when it will be said, 'Happy are the childless who have no little ones to be slain, and happy are those who never will have children. For when Jerusalem suffers for its sins, it will be well for those who have no young ones, for not even the youngest will be spared. And at that time the people of the city will say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills they will cry, Cover us, so that they might escape their fate. But there will be no escape. For if this is what they do when I am here, what will they do when I am gone?" He stumbled on beneath the cross, carrying it upon his wounded shoulders. But he had been so badly beaten that his strength was almost gone. And at last he fell and could not rise. The soldiers cursed and prodded him, but still he could not manage to struggle to his feet with the weight upon his back. "You there!" the soldiers shouted, and they seized upon a man in the crowd who knew nothing of what was happening. The man was Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and they laid the cross upon his back and compelled him to carry it after Jesus. Jesus therefore rose and walked on slowly. The procession continued. Now 2 other doomed men, common criminals, were brought into it to be led with Jesus to the place of death. At last they all reached the place of the skull. When they came to the hilltop, the soldiers ordered Simon of Cyrene to lay the cross down flat upon the ground. Then they removed Jesus' clothes and made him lie upon the cross. They nailed him to it through his hands and feet. Now they raised the cross and planted it firmly in the earth. Meanwhile, other guards were preparing the 2 criminals for crucifixion. And when the 3 crosses were raised, Jesus was in the center, with one robber on his right hand and the other on his left. The soldiers offered Jesus a drink of sour wine mixed with bitter gall, but he refused it. And as he hung there on the cross awaiting death, Jesus called out, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." There was little to do but wait. While they waited, the soldiers divided up the clothes that Jesus had been wearing into 4 parts, one for each man guarding him while he slowly died. But when they came to the tunic and saw that, instead of having a seam, it was woven in one piece from top to bottom, they decided that it could not be divided. Therefore they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots among us to see who shall have it." They did so, and in doing it, they fulfilled the psalm in the scriptures which read, "They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." All these things the Roman soldiers did without knowing that what they were doing had been predicted centuries before. Now Pilate had written a sign in letters of Hebrew, Latin, and Greek saying, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." When the soldiers had finished their business of dividing up the clothes, they set the sign over Jesus' head and settled back to watch him die. The people stood there staring at him. Others passing by along the road stopped to jeer at him and shake their heads in scorn. "You, who would destroy the temple and build it up again in 3 days, save yourself," they mocked. "If you are the Son of God, save yourself and come down from the cross." The chief priests, with the scribes and elders, mocked him in the same way, saying, "He saved others, so we hear, but he cannot save himself. He is the Christ, the King of Israel, and the chosen one of God. Therefore let him now come down from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusted in God. Let God now deliver him if he wants to. For this man said, 'I am the Son of God.'" But though Jesus could have come down from the cross, he would not, for death on the cross was his destiny. The soldiers mocked him too. They came to him offering him sour wine to moisten his dry lips and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, let us see you save yourself." Even the robbers who were being crucified alongside him abused him. One in particular mocked and cursed at Jesus. "Are you not the Christ?" he said. "If you are, save yourself and us." But as the time passed and the first man received no answer, the second man began to see in Jesus a quiet strength he had not seen before. He therefore rebuked the other, saying, "Have you no fear even of God, when you are suffering the same penalty as this man? We too are suffering justly, for we deserve to die for what we have done, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he turned his head to look at Jesus. "Lord," he said, "remember me when you come into your kingdom, for I believe in you." And Jesus answered him, saying, "I tell you truly, today you will be with me in paradise." Then he looked down to see those who stood near him. Close to the cross stood his mother's sister, and Mary Magdalene, and only one of his disciples. Both Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead, and the 11 men who had been his most devoted followers were still in danger from the vengeful priests and Pharisees. Most of them, therefore, were afraid to be seen near him, even while he was dying on the cross. But John, at least, whom Jesus dearly loved, was there with the wailing woman. When Jesus saw John standing at his mother Mary's side and trying to comfort her, he called down from the cross. To his mother he said, "Woman, behold your son John." And to John he said, "John, behold your mother. Care for her." And from that hour John took Mary into his own home and cared for her as if she were his mother. The painful hours dragged by. High noon came, and the sun blazed overhead. Then suddenly the sun was covered by black clouds, and darkness fell over all the land. A strong wind swept the hill upon which the crosses stood, an eerie sound in the strange darkness of the day. Many of the people shook with fear, and many of them left the place of death, trying to escape their fear. But many others, friends and enemies alike, stayed to see the end. 3 hours later, under a sky still ominously dark, Jesus cried out suddenly, my God, why have you forsaken me?" His hearers recognized the words, for they were also in the scriptures that had foretold the manner of his death. There was a brief silence, and the sky began to brighten. Then Jesus spoke again, once more fulfilling the scriptures. "I thirst," he said. There was a bowl of the sour wine standing by. One of the watchers took a sponge and soaked it in the wine, then put it on a reed and held it up so that Jesus might drink. And some of the others jeered, saying, "Let us see whether Elijah comes to save him." Jesus moistened his lips with the sour wine. His work was now accomplished, and he was ready to free his spirit. He cried out again in a firm, clear voice, "It is finished." And to his listeners, it sounded not like a cry of despair, but a cry of victory. Now Jesus spoke his last words on the cross. "Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit." When he had said this, he bowed his head and died. At the very moment in which he yielded up his spirit, the curtain that veiled the inner sanctuary of the temple in Jerusalem was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth quaked, great rocks shattered, tombs opened, and saints rose from their sleep to leave their graves. The Roman centurion in charge of the guard saw how Jesus had yielded up his spirit. He saw the earthquake and many other strange and wonderful things that happened in the moment of Jesus' death. And he was so frightened and amazed that he cried out in glory of God, "This surely was a righteous man," he said in awe. "Truly he must have been a son of God." And others echoed him. But now it was all over. The crowds that had gathered to watch the spectacle turned away, beating their breasts, and went back to the city. But the friends of Jesus and his mother and many women who had followed him from Galilee stayed there, watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Salome, the mother of Zebedee, and the mother of James and John, and Mary, the wife of Alphaeus, and the mother of the other James. All had loved him deeply, and all were overcome with sorrow for their master and for his weeping mother. It was now mid-afternoon, and the beginning of the Sabbath would come with the setting of the sun. And because the bodies could neither be removed from the crosses or allowed to remain upon them on the Sabbath day, least of all during the Passover season, the Jews went to Pilate and asked that the bodies be removed at once. Pilate agreed to their request and sent his soldiers back to Calvary. First they made sure that the two robbers were dead. Then they came to Jesus. They knew he was already dead, yet one of the soldiers thrust a spear into his side, and from the wound there flowed both water and blood. They stared at the limp body in surprise, not knowing that they were fulfilling yet another prophecy. They shall look upon the man whom they have pierced. When it was close to evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who went to see Pilate to ask for the body of Jesus. Now Joseph was a Pharisee and a respected member of the council, but like Nicodemus, he was a good and righteous man who had vehemently objected to any suggestion that Jesus might be harmed. In fact, when the council had held their hasty pre-dawn meeting, they had taken good care to exclude both Joseph and Nicodemus. They knew that these two men were sympathetic toward the Nazarene. What they did not know was that both of them were actually disciples of Jesus and were themselves looking for the kingdom of God through the man from Nazareth. And now Joseph of Arimathea stood boldly before Pilate, asking for the body of Jesus so that he might bury it. Pilate granted permission. Joseph therefore went to the place of death, taking with him fine linen cloths to wrap around the body. Nicodemus went also, taking a mixture of myrrh and aloes to perfume the grave clothes. Ordinarily, the body would be carefully washed and anointed before burial, but there was no time for that. Together the two men took Jesus down from the cross. Together they bound his body in the linen cloths with the spices in accordance with the Jewish custom. Then, with the help of friends, they gently carried Jesus to a tomb in a garden near the place of the cross. It was Joseph's own new tomb, one that he had hewn from rock for the day of his own burial, and no man had ever yet been laid in it. Now Joseph was using it as a resting place for Jesus, so that the Master might be buried before sundown, and in a place where his body would be safe from enemies who might wish to steal or desecrate it. The 11 disciples were hiding in Jerusalem, but the women who had come from Galilee followed the small procession and saw Jesus being gently placed within the tomb. Then Joseph rolled a great stone against the mouth of the tomb and departed for his home. When this was done, the women left too and went off mourning bitterly. And they rested on the Sabbath day, according to the commandment. The first night of sorrow passed. Very early in the morning, the chief priests and Pharisees hurried off to Pilate and made another request. For during the night they had been struck by a thought that had not even occurred to any of the followers of Jesus. "Sir," they said to Pilate, "we remember that when the deceiver Jesus was alive, he said, 'In 3 days I will rise again.' We ask, therefore, that you give orders to have the tomb closely guarded and secured until the 3rd day, for it may be that his disciples will try to come at night and steal him away, afterwards saying to the people that he has risen from the dead." "Take the guard," said Pilate. "Make the tomb as secure as you can." So they went off with the officers and made the grave as secure as they could by sealing the stone and leaving a guard on watch. This was the 2nd day of Jesus' death. When the Sabbath was over at sunset of that day, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome, who had followed Jesus through Galilee, went out and bought sweet spices and ointments so that they might properly anoint the body of Jesus, whom they loved. When the night had passed and the early morning hours had come, they would go to the tomb and make the burial preparations, for which there had been no time before. So the women made plans to go to the garden first thing in the morning. But the 11 disciples remained behind closed doors, afraid for themselves and full of sorrow over Jesus. They had wanted a king, and they had dreamed of glory, and now the dream was gone with the death of Jesus. They had loved him. They had learned much from him, but they had never really understood all that he had told them about the nature of the kingdom of God, or what he had meant when he had said that he would rise again. Now they sat there without hope, staring silently at each other, and not even thinking to count the days. The morning of the first day of the new week dawned. It was the 3rd day of the death of Jesus. The Roman soldiers still stood on watch outside the tomb. With the coming of the dawn, the ground began to tremble and shake, and a great earthquake racked the garden where Joseph of Arimathea had laid Jesus in the cave. An angel of the Lord came down from heaven and rolled away the stone from the mouth of the tomb and calmly sat upon it. His face was as bright as lightning, and his raiment as white as dazzling snow, and his watchers gaped and turned pale with fear. They stared at the angel, quaking, and so overcome with shock were they that they fell to the ground like men who had been struck dead. When they recovered themselves, they got up and fled into the city to report what they had seen. They ran very quickly, and they did not look back. It was very early when Mary Magdalene and the other women came with their spices to anoint their beloved Jesus. The guard had gone, but this did not surprise them, for they had not known that any soldiers had been posted. As they walked into the garden, they were saying to one another, "Who will roll back for us the stone from the doorway of the tomb?" For the stone was much too heavy for the women to handle alone. Then they reached the tomb, and what they saw then did surprise them. The stone had already been rolled back from the cave, and when they looked in through the open doorway, they saw that the body of Jesus was no longer there.